Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The Liberals are facing growing pressure about more than $100 million spent on consulting contracts to McKinsey Company. The opposition suggests the firm got those contracts because of a relationship between the Prime Minister and its former global head, Dominic Barton.
We want answers to these questions. We want to know why the insiders close to Trudeau keep getting rich while everyone else gets poor.
But Barton says that's not the case.
No, I'm not a friend. I have a professional relationship. I don't have his personal phone number, and I haven't been in a room alone with him.
So can the opposition keep making this case despite Barton's denials? And is the issue of government spending on outside contractors being overshadowed by the politics? Let's bring in our panelists, Chantal Hebert, Coyne and Althia Raj. Good to see everyone. And again, as I have to do every time, I am not related to Dominic Barton. So just so that's on the table. Andrew, why don't we start with you? I mean, I think there's the issue of what the opposition was trying to do is suggest that the Liberals are handing money to people that they know, which Dominic Barton says he didn't know the Prime Minister. And then there's the other issue of whether consultants should be getting this kind of money given we have a public service. Which one to you seems like the more important or significant conversation, or are they both important?
Or are they neither?
Fine, yes.
I mean, it will depend on what comes out. This is not a government, shall we say, that deserves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to handing public money to its friends. There have been examples of that in the recent past and in the not-so-recent past. We don't, to my knowledge, have evidence to show that that was a factor in this case. We have Mr. Barton's denials, and until we see evidence to contradict those denials, I don't know whether that's going anywhere. The amount of money involved, of course, sounds like a lot of money to anybody, making a normal salary, $100 million, but it's 1/7 of 1% of even the money that was spent on outside consultants, let alone the $2 trillion in public spending over the last 7 years.
Right.
So the amounts aren't that great. And even when you look at the amounts going to outside consultants, again, I'd like to see the evidence that this was money that was misspent. The mere fact that they went outside rather than to inside advisors, I think you have to look at each case on its own merits. If there were things that the outside consultant could bring, expertise on particular specialized issues that wasn't available in the public service, then that's money well spent.
Althia.
Yeah, I agree with that. We are supposed to eventually find out whether or not it was money well spent because the government MPs have agreed with the opposition MPs to ask the Auditor General to do a value for money audit, which is a pretty risky move, I think, from the government. So it's nice that they agreed to do that. I guess I would say two things. I don't know if the public service should be contracting so much through outside help, but I think it speaks to a bigger problem in the public service, and this is not a sexy issue, and it's not an issue that is going to win you votes, but we do have a public service that is pretty static. Mr. Barton, when he was testifying on Wednesday, talked about how there should be more training, how we need more IT experts, and he's right on those counts. We also have a problem with the fact that there isn't a way really for private sector employees to come in at a mid-level in the public service. So there lacks a dynamic there. There's a risk-adverse culture. Like it would be wise to reform the public service. Okay, yeah. So put that aside. Instead of actually going after what was at the core of this committee study this week, we actually were treated to an embarrassment, I would say, from all sides. The only MP that I didn't find was cringeworthy was Anthony Housefather, the Liberal MP, whose main job there was to play defense. But, we went down a rabbit hole about whether Dominic Barton is responsible for the Oxycontin and opioid crisis throughout the world. Gore Johns, the NDP critic, suggested that the Liberals and the Conservatives were building a shadow government of consultants. I mean, these are ridiculous claims, and they're distracting from the issue at hand, which is actually a really serious issue, and it's unfortunate that MPs took it there.
A serious issue, but to Althia's point, Chantal, not a politically sexy issue, and probably not an issue that's going to get you anywhere politically. I mean, it was a lot of politics at that committee.
It wasn't a lot of politics. It was essentially all politics all the time. Yeah. I would say about the more fundamental question of going out to seek outside advice, that there is still, in theory, there should be a difference between the advice provided by consultants and the advice provided by the public service. The theory being that the public service is there to speak truth to power. And consultants are in the business of getting more business to consult on. So it is in their interest to kind of please up to a point, whoever is paying them. Yeah. But you say the opposition parties, I find the three of them come at this with a different political angle. The Conservatives would dearly like to prove that someone has been lining McKinsey's pockets because of Dominic Barton, who, by the way, does not need the Government of Canada to earn a living at the end of the year. And the Conservative focus is even more understandable when you consider that in power, the Conservatives also dealt with consultants, including Dominic Barton. The NDP wants to expand it to why are we using consultants, and that goes to its proximity with public service unions who dislike the recourse to consultants. And the Bloc Québécois is trying to make a case that Dominic Barton gave advice on immigration to Justin Trudeau that did not take into account the reality that Quebec's way in the Federation would be diminished by massive influx on the immigration front. So they all have different agendas, but none of them are interested in the not sexy stories that we mentioned briefly.
Well, and should any of those things that Chantal outlined there, Andrew, be of concern to Canadians, or like, is that something that people should also be paying attention to? Any of those bits there that Chantal outlined? Well,
we're certainly going to have interesting debates in the future about immigration in Quebec, yes.
Yeah.
And there is, again, there is certainly a legitimate issue in principle about whether the government is steering public money to friends of the government or friends of the ruling party. That's a valid issue in principle, but you actually have to show it rather than just asserting it. Yeah. And so far, there's no evidence that I think that really backs that up. Just back to Chantal's point about, you know, the problem with consultants can be that they're simply telling their clients what they want to hear. That certainly is a legitimate concern. And equally, there's a concern that when it comes to public service, you're going to get sort of the same old. And sometimes you need to shake things up and have people who can bring a fresh perspective. And I think a value for money audit might be the best way to look at that question.
Althia?
Yeah, I would say there was one thing I thought the MPs could have pressed on, because I think it's a legitimate question to raise. Before Dominic Barton became Canada's ambassador to China, he was the chair of the Liberals' Economic Council. So they created this in about 2016 after they'd just come into office, and it was filled with very impressive people who were supposed to guide the government in economic matters. And they were all paid $1. That's not what's at issue. But the help that this council got was given by McKinsey's staff. And this was on a volunteer basis. Now, there are so many ethical rules about what you can and cannot accept in terms of contributions. This clearly was an in-kind contribution. Yeah. And that is a question that deserves being probed. Yep. But they were too busy going down other rabbit holes, trying to score political points, that they didn't actually focus on legitimate questions at hand.
Last word to Chantal on this.
Yeah, well, I think just looking at the headlines this morning that for now, and I agree with Andrew, subject to something else, he won this week and the opposition came out empty-handed for what they were looking for.
Welcome to another round of At Issue. Tonight, we're also taking a look at the tension between the government's newly named anti-Islamophobia representative and some political leaders in Quebec and elsewhere.
I would like to say that I am extremely sorry for the way that my words have carried, how they have hurt the people of Quebec.
Canada's new anti-Islamophobia representative appointed by the Liberal government is apologizing for past remarks she made about the prevalence of Islamophobia in Quebec. Despite the apology, some political leaders, like Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, are calling for her resignation.
This is a bad choice by the Prime Minister, who, making such a choice, kind of destroyed the possible credibility of the function.
Okay, so what's been made of this political opposition to Elghawaby? Does she need to do anything more to appease Quebec and its leaders? Let's bring in our panelists again, Chantal, Andrew, and Althia. Okay, Chantal, what is going to happen here to Ms. Elghawaby and this position, and how much of this is just about politics?
What's going to happen to her versus having a bridge building in Quebec? Well, nothing. That bridge will lead her nowhere at this point. It's not just the Bloc Québécois or the Parti Québécois or even François Legault. It's pretty much the entire Quebec political class that has decided that this is that, we're moving on, would be their answer. But and let Justin Trudeau handle this. I am more interested in what will happen or how much of a hit the Liberals will take in Quebec over this. Because for people who look at it from a distance, it may look like the usual, the National Assembly passes a motion. But seriously, this is the biggest, most wide-ranging backlash against Justin Trudeau in Quebec that I've seen since he became Prime Minister. And remember, the SNC-Lavalin thing here did not play the same way as it played outside Quebec. Yeah. But this reached all the way inside the Quebec Liberal caucus on Parliament Hill, and not just one minister, Quebec Lieutenant, who obviously was not consulted on the appointment, but most of Mr. Trudeau's Quebec ministers were up in arms, and not just because people were angry. So if you go around and you ask, is there something to be done to appease Quebec? No, it's not an appeasement issue. It's just a, even Muslim community leaders who were at that memorial last Sunday for what happened there were calling Ottawa to say, do something about this because we don't need this kind of controversy.
So, I mean, it doesn't sound to me that as though the Prime Minister is going to get rid of the representative, certainly not in his comments yesterday, and certainly not what I'm hearing behind the scenes, Andrew. So I don't know, does it just fade away, or is Chantal's point the right one, that this is going to do actual political damage on the ground?
I'm sure it will, and it will be lasting for a time. They'll have to lie low a little bit. It's an oddity, of course, that in the rest of the country, you get yourself into trouble if you deny that racism is rife and intolerance is everywhere. In Quebec, it seems to be the opposite. It's a little absurd in that, yes, she overstated things, but there is an abundance of research going back years that shows that while there is troubling levels of anti-Muslim sentiment across the country, there are higher levels of it in Quebec. Does that mean everyone in Quebec? No. Does it mean most Quebecers? Probably not. But to say that there's no issue, I think is what seems to be the inclination here, is that it's not what's being done to Muslims in Quebec, particularly by their government, that's the issue. It's what a Muslim woman said about it. And the pile-on and the backlash, I think, was quite troublesome and quite disgusting to watch.
Althia?
Well, what was really, I think, that caused the backlash from so many MPs who are not natural allies of the CAQ government, for MLAs, sorry, that are not natural allies of the CAQ government, is that she seemed to suggest that Quebecers were racist, and that kind of general point of view hampers her efforts to try to build those bridges. But there's a few things I'd like to say. No matter what or who Justin Trudeau would have appointed to this position, the Bloc leader, Mr. Blanchet, would have come out and said that this person was not the right person and that this position should be abolished. I think it is kind of a sign of maturity, perhaps, that he actually decided to sit down with her and hear her out. But, anyone appointed to this position would have said and pronounced things against Bill 21 that describes the law as discriminatory. So that was always going to happen. So I think we need to put that aside. For me, the bigger takeaway this week is that perhaps political parties should stop playing with religion as a way to court votes. We don't really need this position, truthfully. It is a good signal to the Muslim community that the government cares and wants to make sure that it is not enacting legislation that could harm the community, that they have a voice within the government. But they do have a voice within the government. They have a voice through MPs, through cabinet ministers, through the Prime Minister himself, through a number of lobby groups that the federal government actually funds. So, was that position necessary? It was necessary for political points, to remind Canadians that the Conservatives, they didn't even believe Islamophobia existed a few years ago. I mean, that's really what all this was about. And then they put forward a nominee, and then there is backlash. And yes, perhaps there wasn't enough consultation about things that she had written in the past. Perhaps they didn't do a great job of vetting. They certainly did not do a good job of consulting with the caucus on this appointment. But this is not the first time the Liberals have had this problem. And then the backlash ensues. So perhaps it is time to actually, reflect that state and religion are separate. And everybody knows how I feel about Bill 21 and Bill 96, but that we shouldn't try to score points on religion.
Just to point out, though, that the government does have as well a representative for anti-Semitism. It is a former Liberal minister, Irwin Cotler, but they do have someone else dealing with some issues around hatred.
And I would say the same thing about that, and I would say the same thing about when Mr. Harper appointed somebody to the religious freedom. Like, I really don't think we need to be playing in the sandbox.
Yeah, Chantal.
I totally agree with Althia. I'm not sure what the job definition is, except to speak to like-minded people. But if you are going to pick someone, and I would question how much due diligence actually gets done, you probably don't want to pick someone who's been prone to blanket statements, or someone who tweets that it makes her want to throw up when someone suggests that French Canadians did not fare well under the British Empire. If someone wrote on a tweet that it makes them want to throw up when they see the contention that Indigenous Canadians suffered at the hands of settlers, you would not find that person to be appointed to anything. And I'm guessing, and the reaction this week in Quebec, the visceral reaction comes from people who dislike Bill 21 intensely.
Mm-hmm.
But the other issue on the politics and the political damage goes beyond who's insulted by Justin Trudeau to this poll from Abacus this week that showed that 75% of voters, that includes many Liberals, believe the focus of the government on cost of living issues is not as strong as it should be. Well, a week like this kind of drives home the fact that this government is still distracted by side issues as opposed to focusing on its day job.
Very quickly to you, Andrew, last word.
I would say amen to that, and that's been a knock going back some time, is that they don't stick to the bread and butter issues, and bread and butter issues have really come to the fore in the last year or so.
Okay, I will leave it there. Thank you all. Good conversation on both those issues.